Monique Idlet, former treasurer of Connecticut and partner and chief public pension strategist at Apollo Global Management, Shawn Wooden, and United States Representative for California's 43rd Congressional District, Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
I think they love you, Congresswoman.
I mean, look at her outfit.
Thank you all for joining and being here so early on a Saturday. And for those people streaming, we wish you were here, but thank you so much for watching. And I always am excited to have these type of wealth conversations and integrating it with business because there's a lot to be discussed. Everyone's not millionaires and billionaires and entrepreneurs. I mean, how many of you are all just working class individuals? Raise your hand. Phenomenal, right? With pension plans, raise your hand. Great, Shawn, you see that? So a lot to talk about. So when we talk about black wealth, I mean, obviously we know that there are issues there. We know that there are problems. We know that the opportunity gap exists, right? But more so, what's working? How can we copy and paste some of the things that maybe we're not seeing that are working? And I'm so excited to have these speakers on stage to kind of dive into it. You will not, I repeat, you will not find out all the answers about how to tackle black wealth on this panel. We only got 20 minutes. But hopefully it gets you thinking. Hopefully it gets you asking different questions. Hopefully it gets you to just be excited about the future of your wealth. And I know I have a 10-year-old daughter, the future of my child's wealth, right? Exactly. So I would love to start this conversation off. And I'll ask this question. When you hear the phrase black wealth for all of the speakers, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Congresswoman, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. The first thing that comes to mind is there is a huge gap. And when we talk about building wealth, we have to talk about how we think we're going to move toward dealing with closing that gap. It has been predicted that it'll never be closed in our lifetime. But I think because of systemic racism and discrimination, that we can attack it from a systemic standpoint. And so today, what I'd like us to discuss is what's happening with our pension plans. Who gets to invest that money? Whose money is that? That's the workers' money. I also would like to point out what we're doing in the Financial Services Committee that I am the ranking member of to deal with banks and financial institutions that discriminate. How do we break that up? Because when we're looking at the systemic racism that causes the big gap that we're trying to close, because what has happened to people of color over the years, I understand we're never going to get rich because we go to work every day on an 8-hour day job and make $20, $30, $40 an hour. That's not going to happen. But what will happen is we can open up opportunities, break down the system so that people can have better jobs, that we can hire more people, that people can have a better quality of life if we participate in the opportunities, whether we're talking about having those firms that are able to access all of that capital, for example, in our public pension plans, for example, and we have an expert here. Yeah. But I want to tell you, California has $463 billion in pension plans. Texas has $39 billion. New York has $268 billion. Who is investing that money? Who owns the firms? How does that money get invested in our communities? And so I'm looking at what has happened to us systemically and how we can begin to close the wealth gap. If you have elected officials who are willing to take it on, if you have elected officials who are willing to point to it and deal with it, whether we're talking about the pension systems or we're talking about the banks. And so I'm going to stop right there because I know that everybody's got a lot to say. And like I said, I've mentioned pension funds on purpose because we got some experts here.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely dive into the pension funds. And I know I want to get your opinion on the future of the black bank, Congresswoman. But Shawn, I'll pass it to you. Phrase black wealth, you hear it, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think, and it's great to be here. And for all the viewers, I want to frame it in kind of a technical sense. And yes, when I think about black wealth, right away I think about racial inequality. And that's unfortunate. But that's the first thing I think about. But thinking about what is wealth, right? Wealth is not like high income, good paying job, right? Those are all things that may contribute to it. But in a basic sense, it is your assets, right? All of your assets, which are property, bank accounts, savings account, retirement accounts, other types of assets, minus your liabilities, student loans, debt, credit card, consumer debt. And what do you have left? And that's measures what your wealth is. And unfortunately, in the black community, we are at the bottom tiers of what that number equates to, which we're going to get into a bit. But that's, when I think about black wealth, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, Monique?
Everything that has been said before me, but I also think about why every time do we see anything about the gap of our black wealth next to our ability to spend. Every time I'm reading something when we're discussing that the white household is 5 times wealthier than we are, but we also are able to have $1 trillion spend. So we have to first disassociate our spending with what our wealth is. And we have to stop allowing that to be the focus. We also have to start looking at history not just from the trauma, but also the systems that have happened before us where wealth was actually created, i.e. land, right? We have to start learning how to look at history and look at the things that have worked for other cultures so that we can understand how we get back to that. We have to start doing the things that create the wealth too. We have to have grace with each other. If I have information, it's my obligation to share it. If there's something that you understand, you have an obligation to share it. We are not better than each other. We need to collaborate with each other. That is also something that we don't talk about a lot when it comes to our black wealth gap, is that we have a responsibility to each other, to help each other, to inform each other. And most importantly, how do we collaborate in buying land and property and building as a unit?
Well, listen, I want to throw out a stat right fast, and I want to stick with you, Monique, because a lot of people, and I cover business, there's a lot of people who would love to be entrepreneurs. They want to be CEOs of companies, and they want to own, and we're in this era of ownership. And, you know, you look at the average startup for entrepreneurs, right, for white people, $107,000. That's how much they start off with. For black, $35,000. And a lot of black entrepreneurs use credit cards just to get them by, right? Wrong philosophy. Monique, explain your role at Rain Ventures and what you look for when it comes to identifying that entrepreneur and ways that we can kind of cut that wealth gap when it comes down to just starting off with the proper capital so that way we can sustain business.
I think before we can get into what my role is at Rain Ventures, I think we need to understand what is venture capital.
Yeah.
Venture capital is an investment firm that is looking for the highest ROI. The stage that I play in is
return on investment.
Yes, return on investment. The stage that I play in is when we looked at closing this racial wealth gap, it has been looked at from an entrepreneurial perspective, from a micro perspective. But when you look at it from a macro perspective, and this is a global thing, most companies are venture-backed, whether it's private equity, early stage, late stage. So if we want to close the racial wealth gap, then there has to be private equity firms that are owned and operated by black people, right, who are investing in potentially billion-dollar companies that are built by black and brown and women and technically underfunded communities, right? And so I am the founder, I'm the managing partner, and to put it into perspective, yes, less than 2% of venture funding goes to black women, okay? However, no one talks about Joanne Price from Fairview, who built an amazing billion-dollar venture fund. Melody Hobson, who's a partner, myself and my business partner, Erica Minningham, we own 100% our venture firm. The average IRR, which is a return, an interest rate on return for a fund, any fund, is 30%. We're almost 70% IRR at Rain Ventures, and we perform in the top 1% of venture. And so it's our obligation to also make sure we're funding private equity firms that are owned by Black and brown people.
Yeah. Over 50 million assets under management for your firm?
Yes, we do.
And
yes.
Rain Ventures, you guys look into digital health and equity platforms?
No, we focus on consumer tech and enterprise SaaS.
Well, it's very important for me to say, I am so proud of all of you young people who have venture capital firms. Don't forget to say that Serena, is out there.
We co-invest with her, yes.
All right, she's out there with you. But such small amount goes to startup companies that are Black. Yes. Basically, venture capital has been held by white firms.
Yes.
And they didn't take chances that they take on some of the startups that don't look like us.
That's right.
And so you have to be very careful when we talk about venture capital. We've got to build venture capital.
Yes.
And in building venture capital, we've got to help you raise money also.
Yes.
And if the more money you raise, the more you can invest. And we hope that you're investing in firms that you can take part ownership in so you can keep growing that capital that you have to invest. And so my push, and this is what I have to tell you, elected officials have the responsibility to break up these racial companies and the racial systemic discrimination so that we can get to building wealth.
Yeah.
Yes.
The lack of wealth is because of absolute discrimination in the system, all of the financial services system. And so with venture capital, that's a great opportunity for those of you who have gotten into funding some of the startups which would never get looked at by the major venture capital
Like
firms.
a solo funds.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, and I think when we talk to our people, we said, but it's all right to have some skin in the game. When you come to start up a business, it doesn't hurt to start saving a little money. It doesn't hurt to get your family together and say, let's all put X number of dollars into a fund over the next few years so that when we go looking for venture capital, we can say, we got some skin in this game.
Yeah.
We're not just coming to you, asking you to give us something, and we don't have anything. So I really do believe having a little skin in the game. Private equity. I didn't intend to talk about it a lot today. I just convened Blacks in Private Equity because I wanted to talk about what is happening in the Congress of the United States and how we have to take a look at what we do to separate out in our minds all private equity firms being the same. They're not all the same.
No.
And so we're looking at private equity firms who are able to access, properties and companies, and they're able to do what private equity does, to reduce the cost of management and all of that.
Shawn, if you missed the Voice of God, works now at Apollo. He's chief pension strategist for Apollo. And again, we were talking about pension funds earlier, right? And you had a quote that said, there is massive pressure on the U.S. public pension system, right? How many of you have pensions again in the crowd? Raise your hand. Talk to those people now in the crowd and online about what we're witnessing with pensions and what they need to be prepared for, because pension is wealth. That's just money that you're going to need to, as you get older, to sustain yourself. What's going on within the pension system?
So thank you for that question. And before I do, I want to comment, because what you've heard from Auntie Maxine, who's one of our bravest politicians in America.
Give it up for Maxine Waters.
Give it up. And another one of the baddest black women in America, Monique, right here. But what you've heard are two different perspectives, but they all converge on this notion of capital.
That's right.
Capital, right? And that's where pension funds, public pension funds, are one of the largest allocators and sources of capital in America.
That's right.
And so from a federal level, and a lot of what you've done in the Financial Services Committee has been focused on that pot of capital and where that money is going. And that money is essentially worker money.
That's right.
People who have worked all their lives, and depending on a pension check, a lot of that money is from black and brown people, and it's a big pot of money. So what I did as treasurer, and treasurers and trustee boards across this country invest or not in folks like Monique.
That's right.
To provide that capital.
That's right.
But there's not enough capital going to people that look like Monique. And so the way this works is we have been starved historically of capital at all levels.
That's right.
And so and what you hear from Congresswoman Waters is we have to open the doors and access. And politicians and high offices, they have power, they have agency from a policy perspective to lean in and do that. And what you hear here is that we've got the talent, we've got the returns, and we have the numbers. And so I just want to put it in that frame, because a lot, when we talk about closing the wealth gap, we can't do it without opening up the spigot of capital. And we can't do it without opening up the avenues of opportunity.
I want to compliment you, because you were an example that we used in Connecticut. I think at one time...
Wait, don't give it away yet. Don't give it away yet, because I really want to dig into the pensions, about what's happening. Because I know where you're going with the baby program, and I want to touch on that.
That's right.
So pensions.
Yes.
So the pension system, and this is where Jabari is going, is where the pension system in America, one, it's under threat. Two, in a number of years, based on the direction of this country and systems, it's not going to exist anymore. But we're probably talking a couple of decades. And a lot of your retirement is tied up in the pension system. And so a lot of us, and I would often say, I was a city council president many years ago, and the mayor is trying to underfund the pension system, right, to make the budget work. And I said, pensions aren't sexy topics. They don't attract the headlines, right? But there's so much capital, and there's so many people's retirements and futures tied up in it. We got to pay more attention to it. Two, I remember when a mayor eliminated an animal control officer, and there was a march on City Hall. But you underfund your retirement futures, not a peep. Folks, we got to pay attention. As they said, follow the money. That's right. And this is where the money in many of our communities' retirement is. And so that's one piece of that. The other piece, as we think about the landscape of America, and the black community, by and large, has the lowest rate of savings.
$75 billion annual savings deficit. Listen to that number. $75 billion is what we lack saving every year.
Well, because also the way we've been taught to save, we're not looking at historical perspective of insurance policies.
No.
We only have insurance policies for death,
not
We haven't-
annuities.
Exactly.
And yeah, in a plug, so our company, Athene, is the largest issuer of annuities in America. And Athene, so it's retirement services, right? So it is actually part of the future of your retirement security is by making sure you have income when you retire. But I want to make this point loudly and clearly. We have to be more savers, investors, and less consumers and spenders, right? Monique touched upon how much capital we spend. 2, we got to get this message early because the power of compounding interest is so significant for the divide between those who have and those who have not, and their kids who have not, and their kids who will have not, if we don't address this notion.
And I'm out of time right fast. I want to make one last point because I know I wanted to touch on this, Shawn, before we wrap up, is Shawn in 2019, I believe it was?
2021.
2021 helped as controller, state treasurer, at the state of Connecticut, helped implement a baby bonds program. How many people know what that is? Right. So baby bond program is when you're born, and you're born low-income families, but every child will have about $3,200 right away invested into an account when they're born, and they can't touch that money until 18. That's ways that you can cut the wealth gap, right? By giving children that need it in low-income homes an opportunity to have some money that they can use for a retirement plan or whatever when they reach adulthood. Shawn, last thing, because I got to wrap up, how can we get more states to implement this program? Connecticut's already doing it. $390 million they've invested in this program for 12 years. How can we replicate that?
So first, I want to give credit quickly to Dr. Derek Hamilton, who's the intellectual framework around the policy work in the new school. 2, Connecticut, Cory Booker was the first to introduce this federally, which has still not moved in Congress. Connecticut was the first to implement this in the nation, and we have 20 states. We have the District of Columbia that's implemented a program following us, and we have 20 states actively working on this right now. And basically, in order to close the wealth gap, and we've touched a lot upon here in terms of, what I'll call the top 1%, right, which is important. I want more black millionaires and billionaires, and I want that to spread to our community. But in order to close the wealth gap, we got to look at every stratus of society, from cradle to grave, right? And baby bonds is about the cradle, and to start you off with life without or closing the gap on the disadvantage and having an investment account. And what we've talked about towards the tail end is retirement security, but all of these things and everything in the middle, this is an all hands on deck moment. And one of the biggest things that we aren't talking enough about is a lot of us know there are a lot of historic and systemic reasons for the wealth gap that has happened. What we're not talking enough about is the active, everyday, right now, ongoing efforts to undermine attempts at the policy level, the investment level, to address systemic barriers to access to capital. We got to talk more about that because it is ferocious, the assault on DE&I and these other matters.
Yeah. We're out of time, but again, this is something for you to think about moving forward, right? Every issue we're not going to solve on the stage this morning, but as you move forward, it's an important election year. Ask your local constituents about baby bond programs, about your pension, about what they're talking about behind closed doors, about how they're using, what mechanisms, what are they doing to help close the opportunity and the wealth gap, especially amongst our community. Thank you so much for listening.
I'm so
And
sorry
solo
we have
funds.
to stop. I wanted to congratulate him.
We got to congratulate you
what
too.
did. Well, no, I wanted to, but you did it. You did it. And I wanted to piggyback on something she said because we just found a young entrepreneur with venture capital who opened a firm to deal with hair.
Wow.
It's all of this hair that we're spending this money on. And he had a sister who was a hairdresser, and she had some friends. He gathered them together up in Silicon Valley. They've created a firm now. They're importing the hair, and now the firm is $50 billion in a short period of time.
Improving the ecosystem. Improving
That's
the
right.
ecosystem.
That's
Thank you so
right.
much, Congresswoman. I
That's
appreciate
right.
that.
Thank you.
For listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.